This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode of Space Minds, former NASA Commercial Space Division Chief Phil McAlister sits down with host David Ariosto for a wide-ranging conversation about the future of human spaceflight, NASA's internal culture, and the explosive growth of the commercial space sector. McAlister spent nearly 20 years inside NASA, helping spearhead programs like Commercial Crew and Commercial Orbital Transportation Services, which paved the way for SpaceX, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, and a new era of public-private partnerships. He shares stories about internal resistance, political battles, and what it took to shift NASA away from cost-plus contracting after decades of inertia.
Phil McAlister, NASA's former longtime Commercial Space Division Chief. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Yeah, you spent roughly 2 decades, give or take, at the agency, much of which was centered on commercial space and sort of the emerging paradigm that we all now find ourselves in. And on your LinkedIn profile, you wrote, "Thankfully and blissfully retired." So maybe that's a good place to start on all of this, and just reflecting not only on your career, but I mean, gosh, you have seen sea changes within the nature of how we do business in space.
Yeah, so that part was unexpected. The whole reason I joined NASA, it was multifaceted, of course. It wasn't any one thing, but the primary thing that motivated me was I really felt like of all the space markets that could potentially exist, exist, I really felt like private space travel was the one that really could revolutionize things. And I didn't think at that time the private sector could do that solely on its own. Orbital space transportation, human space transportation. I just felt like it was going to need some sort of government help in the terms. At that time, I wasn't thinking public-private partnership, but I thought if anybody's going to do this, it's going to be NASA. And so that's why I joined the agency in 2005. And that was the goal that motivated me through those 20 years and why I stayed so long. Actually, when I joined in 2005, Mike Griffin was the administrator, and I really thought I was just going to stay 2 or 3 years. I had been in the private sector before that, and I kind of wanted to check the box of government service, and I wanted to see if we could get something going on private space travel. Mike lasted about 3 years, and at that time, I almost left. But then Lori Garver came in. She was somebody that I had known and respected a lot in our previous careers, and a couple other people came in, and I was like, oh, well, let's give this a little bit of let's give it a shot, see how long it can go. And then I became the executive director for the Augustine Committee, which was just a fascinating privilege. I know a lot of people say that about their careers, but it really was a privilege to work with Norm Augustine and Sally Ride. I got to meet Sally, and they endorsed Commercial Crew, what ended up to be Commercial Crew. At that time, they didn't call it that. So I was hopeful then. And then in the president's budget, the 2011 budget, the Commercial Crew program was in there and was funded and was structured in a way that I really thought could work, because it was modeled after the COTS program, and I oversaw the COTS program, and I knew it could work. I could just foresee how we could apply those principles to human space transportation, and that's what we did. And that was super successful. 2020 is going to be forever etched in my mind as one of my career highlights, when the SpaceX Dragon took Bob and Doug to orbit and to the International Space Station. And so along the way, just what happened, what you just said, was this sea change in NASA contracting away from cost plus and towards more fixed price contracting. A change that I thought was overdue and very much welcome.
Yeah. Well, let's start
Really,
there. I mean, let's
sure.
start in terms of like sort of the inception of all this. So, you mentioned Augustine, that sort of led to the cancellation of the Constellation program. It's sort of like a redefinition of how we were looking at space flight at that time. All of this was coming on the heels of what happened in 2003 with Columbia, and years later, Challenger. Speaking of which, Challenger, the anniversary, 40th anniversary of Challenger is coming up in January, which is just extraordinary. I mean, if you think about it,
Yeah.
how we did business then, how we're doing it now, the nature of like the shift, and maybe sort of the baked in sort of ingredients of how you sort of evaluate risk in terms of human spaceflight. I think that's really interesting to kind of point to sort of dig in on in terms of the nature of some of that DNA that has been part of the NASA process. That sort of like failure is not an option, sort of Gene Kranz kind of mindset. And then you have, at this point, I mean, sort of leaping ahead a little bit, but you have a commercial space sector that has a lot of founders that have a Silicon Valley sort of background. You talk Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, even Eric Schmidt with relativity space in terms of his former days with Google. So, like, I wonder how people think about this now in terms of this sort of fail fast approach and how that relates to human space travel and where we're going with Starship. There's so many questions that are sort of baked into this thing. I'm not even quite sure where to begin, but maybe a good place to start is that in the inception of all of this, for an agency that's been subject to kind of back and forth and the twos and fro's of the political leanings, the push towards commercial, I imagine the beginning might have felt like that. It might not have felt like this the paradigm shift that we are experiencing now, or did it? I mean, what was the environment like? What was the culture?
Well, so I guess there's two parts to that question. At the time, it was not a welcome change for
Yeah,
NASA. I mentioned this to one of your colleagues when the Commercial Crew program was announced and we started it. Um, I felt very strongly that it was the right thing to do, but I received, and not just me personally, the program received enormous pushback from what I will call the establishment or the old guard. It was not a welcome change at all. NASA had been doing business basically the same way since the big dawn of the space age, really, since NASA was created. These large, very process oriented, traditional programs that use cost plus contracts and traditional defense companies to do the work. And it took a long time. It was super expensive. There were consistently overruns. And I just felt like that was not a sustainable way of doing business.
you also had some
NASA's,
serious headwinds in terms of just like even Apollo luminaries
yes. Oh my
making
gosh.
their opinions
Oh my
known
gosh.
that
Yes.
this is a pledge toward mediocrity, I think was one of the quotes that
Yeah,
kind of
we're seeing the end of human spaceflight. There was all sorts of rhetoric around that, and from people that were well respected. And so it was a. I went to war basically with the agency to a certain extent against the old guard because it was something that I felt so strongly about, and that was the goal, my single focus goal. And I mean, I wasn't going to let anything stop me. I was almost fired multiple times, some of which were my own fault, but some of which weren't, just trying to bring about this change. But it was long overdue, in my opinion. NASA had been doing that, or the way it had been doing business for 40 years when there was no commercial space industry at all. And really, the only companies were big aerospace companies. And that all changed in the really late 90s, beginning 2000. And so NASA had to change because our entire environment was changing, mostly because of the establishment of the commercial space industry. If NASA had had its way, it would have ignored it and kept doing things the way it did. And we needed some real change agents, myself, Lori in particular, some other colleagues of mine internal to the agency. It wasn't just me, even though I was very visible at the time.
Mhm.
And we really had to fight against this. And then, to be honest, David, I really, after commercial cargo, I was getting a little worried that it would just be this one-off thing. Commercial cargo was super successful. But
Sure.
then we got commercial crew, and I'm like, all
And
right.
that's
And when
essentially
that was,
facilitated the development of the SpaceX
it
Dragon and
was
Grumman's cargo transportation systems and the like.
very
But
much so.
Crew is
Yeah.
different though. crew,
Pardon
like the
me?
stakes are different. Crew is
Oh, yeah,
different, right?
very much so.
Stakes are different. The politics are different. The risk tolerance is different. Um,
Yes, and there's astronauts, and that's a big thing. It's a big deal. So I forget my anyway, I was getting to be concerned that it was going to be this one off, and then we got Commercial Crew. It was super successful. I'm like, oh, well, now of
yeah.
course everything's going to change, and we're going to embrace the commercial space industry. And we really didn't. The agency really didn't, in my opinion. They did move away from cost plus contracting, but they didn't do it in a smart way, in a way that I felt like the commercial space companies could succeed. We kind of ignored a lot of the lessons that Commercial Crew taught us. And I wrote this in one of my LinkedIn articles. I tried not to have this happen. I spent many hours giving lesson learned discussions with my colleagues at NASA, doing knowledge transfer videos and other things. And I sent my personnel out to other projects to teach people within NASA how to do public private partnerships and what were the key ingredients to making it successful. And I think to a large extent, NASA did not embrace those other than the move to fixed price contracting. Mostly because they had to, because we weren't going to be able to afford to do much of anything the old way. Uh, I mean, nothing new, in my opinion.
And
SLS and Orion were just sucking all the budget air out of the room. And another one, I mean, we did do Gateway in this sort of weird way, but most of the other commercial initiatives, in my opinion, were incorrectly or inappropriately called commercial, and they just sort of the shorthand. And I fought against that,
yeah,
but ultimately felt, and this is one of the reasons why I'm sitting here blissfully, thankfully retired, is I really didn't think NASA was going to really embrace the commercial space industry. I was getting very, very pessimistic. This probably this time last year about how things were going to go, and so I retired. This was before all the deferred, resignations and or retirements and all that. It was just
mhm,
time for me to go. And here it is a year later, and my position still hasn't been filled.
yeah.
Um,
I
so
mean, that's sort of the sort of the broader question, I think, in all of this, in the context of not only sort of there's this push now that we've seen in almost, I mean, I think it's safe to say it's sort of an unprecedented fashion, at least in terms of the modality of what we're approaching. I mean, certainly the 1960s was a different kind of push, but this one has one baked in terms of the commercial applications. We see all these new, endeavors that are happening, particularly in LEO, but not just.
mhm,
And it's wrapped in this broader competition internationally, namely Beijing. And,
mhm.
and and you were there at the agency to kind of like watch maybe from afar the maturation of that agency and merging as sort of a real rival to the United States and NASA.
Mhm.
And I wonder in that context where there was a degree of inevitability in terms of this push towards commercialism, given the nature of the ISS, in the sense that's set to retire. I mean, it's done its job by all accounts, but I mean, within the course of less than 5 years, that the plan is to deorbit this. Well, I think it's what that constitutes the largest piece of machinery ever put on orbit, and so, you know. China's Chang'e space station is fully in operation, and I wonder like how you think about this in terms of not having that gap in Leo and not sort of seeding some of this sort of exciting science that can be tucked on board, but also just the sheer presence of being there and like the ripple effects that has.
Yes. Well, so I have kind of a contrarian view on that. Uh, I'm probably a contrarian. That's why I took on Commercial Crew, right? Nobody wanted it,
Yeah.
but me and a few others, but I took that on. And so when it comes to China and low Earth orbit, my personal view is I think all this rhetoric around making it a race, I think is misplaced.
Mm.
And I think if China were to get back to the moon or to get there to the moon before we get back, I don't think it's going to be a huge deal. I think it'll be a
Hmm.
1 week story, not a 1 day story, but a 1 week story,
Right.
because it's been done before. I mean, the whole reason why Apollo was so amazingly effective was because it hadn't been done before, super hard. Now,
Yeah.
getting to the moon is hard-ish. It's not super hard. I don't think we can say something super hard when we did it 50 years ago, or 30 years ago successfully. It's hard-ish and it's really expensive, but I don't think it will have the resonance that it will now, for them to get there before we get back. I think if they get there, we'll say, "Hey, congratulations, welcome to the party. Don't touch any of our stuff." Or what
Right.
took you so long, right? And whoever's in the, whatever administration is in party, they're going to blame the previous administration or the one before that. And I think people are just going to move on, uh, because I just
Well,
don't
that's
think it's going to have the kind of resonance that it had in Apollo. So I don't think a gap is any big deal. I don't think people are really paying attention that much, the
yeah.
general public. And it's really cool that we've had people in space continuously for 25 years. But if there were to be a hiccup in that for a few years, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's going to matter too much. So I
So
wish people would just stop talking about this race with China, because we might not win. And if we just said, hey, we're going to get there when we get there. If China happens to have a base there, that's perfectly fine. China can't take over the whole moon. They certainly can't take over all of Shackleton Crater. That's just ridiculous. It's impossible. So they could set up a base. We could set up a base. That's what's going to happen inevitably, regardless of who gets there next, or if they get there first before we get back. We're going to have two bases. There's going to be a China base. There's going to be a U.S. base in Shackleton. And I don't think it's really going to matter long term who got there first. What's going to matter is who can be there sustainably.
mm,
And that's why I think SLS, Orion, and Gateway have to go, because those are not, it's just not sustainable. Everybody has said that, everybody knows it. It's just a matter of time when those programs get canceled. It was supposed to be after Artemis 3, now it might be Artemis 5, but the writing's on the wall. That is not a sustainable program. And if we
yeah.
continue doing that, in my opinion, 10 years from now, when the Chinese are plugging in their nuclear reactor on the moon and looking over at our abandoned moon base because we couldn't keep paying for those missions, it was unsustainable. That's what's going to happen if we continue on the same path. We're going to need to rely more on the private sector, more with fixed price contracting in a way that NASA is not really comfortable with. We think deep space is sort of the traditional way we should be doing things. And I think NASA was more than happy to give LEO to the commercial space industry. But deep space was kind of a different deal. And they're like, well, you know, Elon and commercial space, you guys can have LEO, but deep space is still ours. That's not going to be true anymore. And it's certainly not going
I
to be
mean, it certainly
sustainable.
seems like the case in terms of what Elon is talking about with regard to Mars, development of Starship, Peter Beck with in regard to even, Venus
Exactly.
missions. I mean, we have
Exactly.
sort of this old mindset in which, commercial mindset that the commercial aspects focus on LEO and Earth's orbits, where NASA is reserved for the bigger stuff. You said a lot of stuff in that point. So before I wanted to get to the last question, if you're taking the contrarian perspective, I gotta push back a little bit in terms of this.
Sure.
So
Bring
so
it.
let's see how this goes. So the you said hardish, right? I mean, and I might like concede that point in terms of moon landings, but this is the South Pole. This is Shackleton Crater's right near that lunar south, where you have these hundreds of degrees of variable temperature swings and eternal darkness and constant light, and the importance of sort of the if we're talking about lunar resources in terms of water, they only exist in certain parts, right? In those sort of those permanently shadowed craters. So the counter argument to that is that if you establish a base, it needs to be established near in some proximity to those locales, and in terms of the regolith that gets kicked up, in terms of moon landings, you have to establish some sort of perimeter. So if you do that, those perimeters can be quite wide, and it's not outside the realm of possibility that those perimeters essentially take over the more valuable terrain on the moon. And so if we're talking about a perspective of flags and footprints, I can see the point. But if we're talking about sustained presence, much like what the Chinese are talking about, and to some extent now what NASA is talking about in a sort of a greater way, I wonder if there's a primacy to being first here. And you know, the Cold War rhetoric has there's some damaging aspects to that, admittedly, right? Because it seems like there has to be a sense of working together in some capacity. But I wonder, like, if a certain nation or certain company gets in a place first and is able to establish sort of a de facto claim of the region, whether that matters in terms of the ripple effects and the geopolitical concerns and the broader, technological downstream effects that all of this has in sort of this new paradigm that we're all looking at.
I think that would be true if they could effectively set up this perimeter that you're talking about. I don't believe that's possible. The rim of the Shackleton crater is about 40 miles long. That's about the distance from DC to Baltimore. Is it possible to defend that entire line on the moon? I don't think so. And even if we were first, do you think we would establish a keep out zone of the entire Shackleton crater? No, the international community would not tolerate that, nor should it. So I don't believe we should take over that entire crater. I think, just like you said, we can all cooperate. We can all have our space. Even if we have property rights on the moon, which I think are inevitable and necessary for the moon to really become a
Which
resource.
flies in the face of sort of the Aerospace Treaty at that point. So I mean, this seems
Potentially,
like
yes,
we're due for a bit of an update.
we are due for a bit of an update, absolutely, and we have been for a long time. So I really think that it's inevitable that there are going to be multiple countries on the moon, and I don't believe anybody's going to be able to say this is our sole province of this huge area. It would be difficult to do that on the Earth, to defend that much territory outside of your own country. I just don't think it's possible. But you're right. If that were possible, if they could set up a perimeter and it would be de facto all of another countries, and they could say, "Don't, you can't come in," then I do think that would have more serious geopolitical implications. I think what's much more likely is for us to have some sort of cooperation on the moon,
Yeah.
which I think will be a super positive development. Again,
But
we
if it
don't want
does
to.
involve property rights, because right now we have these sort of de facto and de jure claims in terms of what it's almost akin to like having a lander, just like these mini embassies that might be reflective on the lunar surface, though. But one of the hallmarks of that '67 treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, was that it had such widespread buy-in, and we've seen subsequent treaties not have the teeth of that one. And I wonder now in this context, in which you have kind of a bifurcated system in which you have Artemis and you have all the nations that have signed on to that, but then you have, the International Lunar Research Station is pushed by the Chinese and the Russians and,
Mhm.
buy-in from the Pakistanis. And so there's almost like this cleaving now in terms of what the future of humanity might look like in terms of which side is coming to bear, and that has real implications in terms of international law, in terms of just conflict avoidance and all like the nitty-gritty of actually how you operate on orbit and in the cislunar space and the moon really matters when it comes to those types of things. I don't know how you
Absolutely.
square that now in terms of this competition.
Yeah, it's very difficult to see how all that's going to play out. It's going to take a half a century for those norms and rules to really become established. And my crystal ball becomes kind of fuzzy after about 1 or 2 years out. I
That's
really
fair.
can't predict out 50 years, but I do know the things that we think are important here in the country: freedom, capitalism, I think, is at the core of what this nation's all about. Competition, and property rights. I believe that is fundamental to us as a country, and I believe we are going to take those values with us into outer space, and we might encounter another political entity that has different rules, and we're going to have to figure out how to get along.
Yeah.
or not if something happens to one of them or not. I mean, that's why you have to just going to have to be flexible. But I do agree that the way it's shaping up right now, certainly with Artemis Accords and the Lunar Village concept, you have two very different ideas, but I think they're totally coexistible.
Mm.
Even as different as they are, as fundamentally incompatible, that's fine. Look at all the different political systems we have here on Earth, innumerable, and we're all getting along relatively peacefully. Not to mention the big engagement that Russia's taken into Ukraine. There's always going to be some flare-ups, I think. But
Well, to your point, I mean, there's a lot of precedent for this. A lot of precedent for Cold War adversaries working together, not only aboard the ISS, but even in the Arctic. There's do
yes,
search and rescue operations between the Russians and the Americans that are still going on that are like just north of Svalbard because the conditions are so harsh and so foreboding that it's almost like those things kind of wither away just for the moment and then come back in spades. But I'll ask you to break out your crystal ball once more, but not in terms of this broader geopolitical paradigm that we're all kind of
okay,
trying to navigate our ways through, but NASA especially. And when you
yes,
look at NASA and the long-term strategy that agency has, and the emergence of the commercial sector, particularly in LEO, but really of all of Earth's orbits, do you see NASA as being still that sort of anchor customer? It's funny to even use the term customer in terms of the modern
yeah,
landscape, but I think that's fair in terms of
yes,
the move from architect to client. Or is there like this scenario where NASA steps back in a really profound way and focuses on things like James Webb and others?
right. So if you'd asked me that question 2 or 3 months ago, I would have had a much darker view of how we were going. I had left the agency. I didn't see any commercial space division anymore. Most of my colleagues that really knew about commercial space had moved on, and I didn't see anybody in leadership at NASA that really embraced those and the goals that I did. After Kathy Leaders left,
Hmm.
the agency, I didn't see anybody in senior management that even really knew what commercial space was all about. Certainly not my boss, as much as I tried to teach him. Uh, and so I had a pretty pessimistic view of things. We had, when you look at the administrator here, this is a good example of what I'm trying to say. We had Mike Griffin for a period of time, then we had Charlie for a really long period of time. Uh, and then we had Jim Bridenstine. And I remember when Jim came in, younger person, had a kind of a new way of doing business. Certainly, he tweeted things, and it drove our PAO people crazy because you
We
weren't
just had
supposed to
him
do
on,
that.
actually. We just had him on the
Yeah,
show, actually.
you had to clear everything through public affairs, and now he's just tweeting out, and I was like, oh my God, well, he's bringing new ideas, right? And new ways of doing business. And Jim was much more receptive to the commercial space industry. At that time, I thought things were only going to get better and better and better, right? We would get fresh leadership, willing to embrace commercial space more and more. And then, in a lot of ways, we went backwards with Bill Nelson. It was a very unusual choice in my mind, but that wasn't even my father's NASA. That was my grandfather's NASA, the way he looked at the agency. So, the trend that I saw so clearly going towards more commercialization, I felt like we had basically lost time, 3 years of just really not moving in the direction that I felt like the agency should go in.
Well, it's a
And
question then. Does the agency then start to resemble, like if you're looking way out in the future, start to resemble this almost like FAA style overseer?
yeah, so that's a whole
Or is
nother
it?
different, yeah, that's a whole different question that I'll get to in just a second.
But I
So
mean, but I think it's,
so
it's all kind of baked into one in the sense like
it could
NASA
be,
is like NASA is the only agency I've ever seen that people you can go overseas and people have NASA T-shirts and NASA hats. Like no other
that
U.S. government agency that has that.
is
And
absolutely
I
true.
wonder like is something is well here's the question maybe is something lost maybe in terms of the push towards commercial that when we achieve these great things in space, not to take anything away from all the amazing things that the commercial industry is doing. But that 1969 landing, that summer, was was humanity's sort of collective moment. And I
Mhm.
cannot tell you how many people I've interviewed who were from different corners of the world that ended up gravitating and coming to the United States and working in the space
Mhm.
industry precisely because they remembered that in their childhood or had, the downstream effects of it. But the point is that it was like this collective moment. And do you get the same? I mean, I'm not presupposing an answer to this, but do you get the same thing in the commercial space when you have
No.
companies that's
No, you
doing
don't. No, you don't. But that doesn't mean that's a bad thing.
that?
We had this epic moment with Apollo, and now things are different and things are going to change. I don't think we should be trying to recreate Apollo and that unbelievably historic moment that we had. I think, again, the environment's different now. To recreate Apollo in some other fashion, I think, is not only impossible, but inappropriate because we now
Mhm.
do have we can do so much more with a strong, vibrant commercial space industry in
Yeah,
space than we could without it. Because without it, everything costs so much more. I mean,
yeah,
we could have hundreds of Starship launches for the 5 or 6 SLS launches and Orion launches potentially. So we could be doing so much more. This is what I used to preach when I was at NASA. If we didn't have the commercial space sector, our aspirations in space would always be limited by the NASA budget. That $25 billion plus or minus 2 billion, right? That would be the limiter of what we could do in space. With the commercial space industry, it is not limitless, but it is certainly magnified
yeah,
multiple times when you look at all the investment from all the different companies that have come in for commercial space. So if you really want to explore space, if you're really a space nerd, really a space enthusiast, you cannot help but embrace the space industry because it enables so much more exploration than we could possibly have done. So, yes, you might
Also,
not get that.
also Apollo. I mean, that was commanding like 4% of U.S. GDP at that point. I
Yeah,
mean,
we're never going back
we
there.
were there.
That's never going to happen, right? That was a one time in history kind of moment, and we've all,
Do you
I
think
think,
so? Do you
agreed
think
that
so? Do you think that will never happen? I mean, in terms of like,
uh,
the growing development of the commercial sector and the increased primacy and, the sense that, we're moving more and more machines on orbit and this, conceivably could be sort of a new home in terms of where our data lives and AI processing and, the growth of this to the point where it's not as I don't want to liken this like to commercial air travel because I think we're a long ways away from that, but to the point where it becomes so important in terms of just the national story and the economics
mhm.
behind that and the geopolitics that sort of wrap it all together. Um, is it like is that 4% is that really just a one-off? I mean, I
Yes,
don't
in
know.
terms
I'm
of
sure you,
Yes, in terms of federal expenditures, we can still have that future, David. We can still have that future where we've got all this infrastructure and all these people living and working in space. It just doesn't have to be paid for by the federal government. It pays for it in a different way and through competition, capitalism, and economic returns. And there will be, in my opinion, always a place for NASA to do those things that don't have an economic potential,
yeah.
that don't have an obvious return on investment, where you can't get private capital because there's just no return on investment. So I believe, even with as strong a proponent as I am for commercial space, because I really do want to explore space, the moons of Jupiter sound super cool. Mars, I want to go to all these places, but we can't do it with federal money only. We are going to
Right.
have to do it a different way. And if you looked at my last LinkedIn article about the parallels to Mount Everest climbing, it's the same sort of thing. I mean, uh, when Sir Edmund Hillary climbed Mount Everest for the first time, it was epic, and it was extraordinarily expensive and
Yeah.
extraordinarily labor intensive. When you look at it today, nobody cares because people are going up all the time. But
Right.
the number of people that scale Mount Everest is immeasurably higher now because private industry came into the business of uh, mountaineering and going up Mount Everest. So if you want to keep the old paradigm when only two people can reach the summit and you've got hundreds of Sherpas and more hundreds of porters all helping in these huge expeditionary kind of programs that cost hundreds and millions of dollars. You want to do that so 2 or 10 people can climb Mount Everest, or would you rather have a different future where
Yeah.
hundreds of people can go to Mount Everest? I want the alternate future that can only happen with a vibrant, successful, healthy commercial space industry. And I think
But
NASA has started that.
I'm glad you mentioned federal dollars, because when you evaluate commercial partners, there is like there's a question there, right? There's like a question of what's truly commercial versus a contractor with sort of a different badge, right? Because
Mhm.
a lot of these programs, SpaceX included, Blue Origin included, they're underpinned by federal taxpayer dollars. They're routed a different way, and certainly the operations and sort of the sense of autonomy and growth within the industry itself is much more commercialized than it might have in the old cost plus valuation.
Mhm.
But these companies don't get as big as they are. They don't do the big things that they're planning on doing without federal taxpayer funding. And I wonder in that context, in that construct, whether the Achilles heel of the American space program, which has always been the fickle nature of it. We orient towards one policy, and then a new administration comes in, we orient somewhere else, and we're doing Mars, we're doing the moon, we're doing this, and it just, it's all this sort of changing of priorities, and this is where it maybe goes back to that competition, um, and how that ultimately manifests in terms of what are we trying to achieve on orbit and deep space and all these other things. Um, and so maybe the commercial sector insulates us a bit more. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. What's your sense?
Well, so I think you got to really be clear about what you're saying and what you're thinking about. Yes, all those commercial space companies that you mentioned do receive some number of federal dollars, but it's not a subsidy. NASA is getting a return on all of that investment, and it's multiple times the dollar. The benefit that we get from spending a dollar in as far as an anchor customer for the commercial space industry versus a dollar on a cost plus traditional
Sure.
contract, it is immeasurably
Oh
higher.
yeah. No, I mean I
So
wasn't
yeah,
questioning
so
that.
that's what I would
I
say.
guess
It's
like
not
the
a
insulation from political wherewithal. That's the question, right?
oh,
Because
I'm sorry. Yeah.
there's
So
still there's still a reliance on that. Then like
yes.
these are not companies that exist regardless. Now, SpaceX probably would, but
No, I,
in
I
terms
made this case about 10 years ago that NASA is still the big kahuna when it
right,
comes to spending and one of the major customers. So where NASA
and so
goes,
that has some of the same old like
it will.
pendulum swing problems, I would
There
imagine.
certainly will until there becomes critical mass that enables the private sector to do it all by itself, which occurs and exists today in communication satellites.
Yeah,
That market has been self-sustaining without the government intervention or support for decades. We don't really have any other market currently. I think it's going to be public space travel, but we're not quite there yet,
yeah,
obviously. So I do think in this sort of transitory period, again, you can look back to my LinkedIn article about Mount Everest. There was this expeditionary period, and then there was this transition period where things started to change, but governments were still involved. They just weren't the sole operator, architect, and funder of all these expeditions. And now you've
yeah,
got it where it's commercial. It's completely commercial, and the governments aren't in there except for some regulatory function. I think that's what's going to happen in space. And right now we're in this sort of transitory phase. I don't know how long it's going to last, but I do think it will require the commercial space sector and NASA working much more closely together. And when I was about to say that I would have had a different answer 2 months ago than where we're going, two things have really changed. One, we have Jared Isaacman, an unbelievably forward-looking, probably the best person to be running the agency, willing to embrace commercial space and willing to fight for it. He's got a lot of energy, Jared, and I wish him all the best. And Blue Origin flew New Glenn. And a lot of people were saying, oh, it's just SpaceX, the commercial space industry. You can't point to another another one like that. Well, certainly not like SpaceX, but now you got, it's not just SpaceX, it's Blue Origin and it's Rocket Lab that's created this niche and certainly is going to, seems to be a going concern. And then you've got all these other wannabes that are pretty close. One or two of those are going to make it through, and then we're going to have this. The genie's not going back in the bottle. I kind of thought it was 2 or 3 years ago. I thought NASA was going to shove it back in the bottle, and we were going to do all this cost plus, and everybody forget about Commercial Crew and the way we were doing it. But now I don't think that. With the combination of Jared, with the combination of New Glenn, the combination of some of the other successes we've had in the commercial space industry, I think the genie's out of the bottle. It's an inevitability, and the large aerospace companies better get good at a different business model because the old one isn't going to work anymore. If they want to continue to be space explorers, they're going to have to change and have a different way of doing business because the old way is not coming back in any large form. I do think, like I said, there will still always be some JWST missions, some unique things that don't have a commercial or economic potential that only NASA could do, and we're going to decide as a country we want to do those things. And so that might require a more traditional approach, maybe not completely like the old way with some differences, but I do think there's always going to be an mission like that. And it's just the proportions are going to have to change. So
I mean, I mean, the way you describe it, I mean, it almost just makes me think of sort of like the early settlement of this country, in the sense that you had some of those early company towns, Virginia company that was, getting a loan from investors in England and kind of starting here, and you had these like company towns that spring up. You do have questions though in terms of, transparency and democratic governance, and there's other problems that can arise from that, but I don't know that there's any utopia in terms of any of this, but it's a fascinating
yes.
time and a fascinating conversation. I really can't thank you enough for joining us. Phil McAlister, NASA's former longtime commercial space division chief, and certainly has a few ideas that you can check him out on LinkedIn. So thanks so much for joining us. And it doesn't sound like you're blissfully retired at this point. It sounds like you got some kick left in you.
Yeah, I'm sticking around a little bit. I'm gonna keep following NASA and the space program for till the end of my days. It's part of my DNA. You can't be at a place 20 years without loving it. And I didn't love every minute. But when I look back over my career of 20 years, I really did love it there. I still love NASA as much as I do believe it needs to change and want it to change. That doesn't mean I don't love it. I'm just able to look at it and look at the way we can do things better. And that's always been my outlook and my hope for the agency.
Phil McAlister, thanks so much. Thanks again for
Thank
joining
you.
us.
Appreciate it.